This is a 5 to 7 minute video which will take you through the major steps of building this 3-in-1 crib. The crib has an adjustable height mattress and converts from a basic crib to an intermediate bed and then finally to a full-size bed. Starting out with the raw material, in this case I used a combination of 4/4 or 3/4 inch soft and hard maple. My usual method of building involves limited plans, but in this case I needed a means of conveying my thoughts to the mother and father-to-be. The plans are a combination of a couple of cribs of various big box stores and specialty shops. The starting point was to get a good edge on all the lumber, and then rip the rough leg, spindle, and rail stock. Finally cutting it all to length. I built a simple jig to use with the router bushing for routing the mortises and the ends of the spindles and the mating rails. I used floating tenons for construction, figuring this would provide for more forgiveness in assembly. There are 42 spindles making 84 mortises in the spindle ends and the same amount in the mating rails. The routing method is pretty standard, using a plunge router and cutting the mortise in 3 passes about 1/4 inch deep with each pass. On to forming the tenons. This was a simple task of ripping 1/4 inch stock to a required width and then rounding the edges of the roundover bit, then cutting the tenons to length. To make sure I got equal spacing on the spindles, I built a spacing jig for use during glue up. All the parts and pieces are ready for glue up. I started with the legs. The material for the legs was cut a slight bit on the larger size to allow for cleanup and sanding. On to assembling the sides. Here you can see the spindle spacing jig being used during the glue up process. Once all the sides were glued up, it was time to cut the semicircles at each end of the spaces between the spindles. I used a jig and a flush trim bit on the router for this. Here you can see the somewhat tedious process of repositioning the template each time. The crib is constructed and held together using furniture connector bolts and threaded inserts. I wanted the heads of the connector bolts to be flush with the wood. First, I drilled a shallow insert with a Forstner bit. The bolts have a beveled connection between the head and the bolt itself, requiring a second countersink to be drilled to get a smooth and flush fitting. I knew going in that it would be tough to get a good edge on the ends of the sides, so I planned for a little extra material so I could trim the edges smooth with a flush trim bit and a piece of MDF for a template. Now that I have the holes in the posts, I need to accurately mark the holes in the side sections for the threaded inserts. To do this, I took a connection bolt and filed a point on the end for marking the center of the hole. I assembled the sides and the poles with clamps and marked each hole accordingly. To make sure I drilled straight and centered pilot holes for the threaded inserts, I used a dowel jig. To locate the holes for the mattress support bolts, I modified a set of connector bolts with points, threaded them into the side posts, and assembled the sides using clamps. I backed the sharpened connector bolts out into the edge of the sides to mark the holes. Sanding. Did I tell you there was sanding? A lot of sanding. Every edge, with the exception of the edge to post joint, was rounded with a 1/8 inch roundover bit. Here, the father-to-be is doing his part. Part of the design that was a must was the cross member on the bottom. This is not a structural member and is held in place with connection bolts. The angles run at a 45-degree and butt up to the legs of the corresponding 45-degree inset. I used a simple jig made from a 2x8 with a 45-degree groove cut lengthwise to cradle the legs while I dadoed the recess. With everything assembled, sanded, and cleaned for painting, I got into the mixology of paint spraying. I used an Erlex high-volume, low-pressure HVLP sprayer. The sprayer specs called for a viscosity of less than 160 seconds through the viscosity measuring funnel. I found better results with a viscosity around 60 seconds. 3 coats of paint and 4 coats of clear gloss overcoat, and that's it.